It's an honor to be chosen to give the Harold Siebens Lecture and also to meet members of his family. I'm going to dispense with my usual Greenpeace history preamble because of time, so if you have questions along those lines afterwards, please be free to give them. But I want to just go through and give you more like impressions of this topic, energy, climate, and the Canadian oil sands. For some reason it happens, turning it from Keynote to PowerPoint, I had the word tar with 2 slashes through it there in red, and it would have been funny. But now it just looks stupid. But picture that in your mind. So I'm going to just go straight into it. I'm going to talk about energy in general for a bit here because the oil sands and oil has to be contexted in the larger energy picture. I like using this because the big box on the bottom shows the amount of solar energy that's coming into the Earth each year. And the little green one on the very bottom shows the amount of that solar energy that is converted into plants through photosynthesis. Mostly trees, but all our food crops and all the plankton in the sea, the very basis of all the rest of our life. And on the very top is the annual consumption of energy by human beings. As you can see, plants use quite a bit more energy than we do. And then the 4 boxes below that on the top are the known reserves of oil, natural gas, uranium, and coal. Interestingly, though, the uranium box represents 1 pass through a nuclear reactor. 99% of the potential energy is still in the used fuel after the first pass. So if we build fast reactors, which China just bought 2 from Russia because they know the future, that uranium box becomes 100 times larger than it's shown there, thus making it clear that long after the fossil fuels are depleted, and they will be one day, there will be uranium to run nuclear reactors for our civilization for thousands of years into the future, and it's a darn good thing, because if the oil and gas and coal ran out and there was nothing to replace it, we'd be in a bit of a pickle. But we're actually going to have long-term nuclear energy into the future at large, high levels with no end in sight. We can end up taking uranium out of seawater economically. 86% of today's world is run by fossil fuels. This is the conventional energy sources, as it says on the bottom, not including gathered wood or biomass, which actually is a fairly large amount of the world's energy too. But this is the stuff that's in the market. And as you can see, other than the 3 fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, hydroelectric and nuclear are really the only significant other producers of energy we have today. Greenpeace, my old friends, oppose all the fossil fuels because of climate change. They're against hydroelectric dams and want to tear some of the existing ones down to let the rivers run free. And they want to shut down every nuclear plant in the world and never build another one. You are left with less than 1% of the world's energy. So this is obviously not a path to a sustainable future. We have to be a bit more clever than that. And here's what we do with the energy. Industry, making cars and planes, uses 27% of it. Transport uses 20%. And unknown to most people, where it says residential and service, they really mean infrastructure there, like buildings. And most people don't realize that buildings are the largest use of energy for heating and making hot water and all the electricity that comes into them. And then there's other uses for a total of 100%. Wood is the most abundant renewable energy resource. 70% of all the world's renewable energy is based on wood and woody materials. It's also the most important renewable material in the world for constructing all our houses, etc. And yet, you wonder why I left Greenpeace. Well, they're against the world's most important renewable resource. That's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to leave Greenpeace. How ridiculous it is for an environmental movement to be against by far the most important renewable resource in the world, which is wood. Last time I looked, trees was the best place to get that from, and they actually grow back in the forest when you cut them, but no, we're against that. Greenpeace actually just put out a report called Biomass, about biomass energy, in which they describe wood as a Stone Age fuel. They're not only against the world's most important source of renewable energy, they're also against the world's second most important source of renewable energy, which is hydroelectric power, which produces more electricity than, way more than all the other renewables put together. Well, not except wood, but electricity on the electricity side, because we don't make a lot of electricity from wood, although Sweden does. And we could do better here on that score too. Three Gorges Dam. Greenpeace succeeded with its allies in getting the World Bank to pull its support for this project back in the 80s. China, because we buy a lot of flat screen TVs and such, had enough money to do it themselves. And it's a good thing because it replaces 40 coal-fired power plants, prevents thousands of people from dying from floods in bad flood years, and allows them to irrigate twice as much land as they could before when they didn't have control of their river. So it's a sustainable development, economic, social, environmental, all three counts. And yet it's still being vilified as some sort of catastrophe. No, it is a hydroelectric dam. There used to be a valley there with three gorges in it. Now there is a lake full of fish. Nothing wrong with that, in my estimation. Wind energy. Look at China go with the wind from all the money we spent buying flat screen TVs and wind turbines that are heavily subsidized in the industrialized countries, Europe and North America. Note the lack of wind in the countries that don't have the same kind of money to waste as the big industrialized countries do. That's because the only place wind energy is going in is where it is heavily subsidized with taxpayers' money. And what do you get? You get a power curve that looks like this in Germany over a period of a few days. One day you got 12,000 megawatts, the next day you got nothing. How do you run the Mercedes factory that day? You know, it's ridiculous. And it also costs 4 or 5 times as much as conventional power. I'm not even going to talk about solar voltaics because they cost 5 to 10 times as much, and it was a stupid idea to start putting them out on the grid in large numbers. Here's where the shale gas is that we know. The gray areas, they haven't really explored it yet. Obviously, Russia and Mongolia and other countries in Africa probably have a whole bunch of it too. It's basically old sea bottoms where plankton fell down and mixed in with the mineral sediment and then eventually was turned into hydrocarbons through heat and pressure deep down in the ground. They just announced yesterday that the Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming oil shale, which is like our oil sands, only it's in rock rather than in sand, has the same amount of oil in it as all the known conventional oil reserves in the world. Enough oil to run the United States completely for 200 years at its full, in other words, to supply all domestic oil for the US. So one of the points I want to make right at the beginning is we are right now, I believe, in a new era just emerging in the environmental debate and the sustainability debate. I've spent nearly 25 years since I left Greenpeace trying to bring some science and logic to this discussion. And finally, the chickens are coming home to roost. Kyoto is dead. It was a stupid process to begin with, and hundreds of millions of dollars were wasted flying people all over the place to try and make a deal that could never possibly have been made. You could have asked any mediation arbitration guy, can you make a deal out of this situation? And they would say it's impossible. Because India was never going to agree with the United States. The United States said, we won't lower ours unless India lowers theirs. India says, we won't even do anything until you lower ours and let yours and let ours come up to meet it so that they're equal. How are you going to make a deal out of that? Canada is showing leadership by pulling out of Kyoto, and it might as well be over anyways. It ends this year. But we did show leadership there, because if we want to reduce fossil fuel consumption, that was obviously not the way to do it. The second thing that just happened is the European Union just announced that they will not attend the Rio Plus 20 conference in Brazil, which goes back to the 72 conference in Stockholm, the 92 conference in Rio. This is a big deal. It's the UN Showcase Environmental Meeting, and the EU says they're not going because Brazil is charging too much for the hotel rooms. These are people from Geneva who say, they're gouging them for hotel rooms in Brazil. The real reason they're not going is because the G77 developing countries have said, no more of your green fantasy agenda. We want to put poverty eradication at the top of the international agenda, and we don't want your agenda, Europe, which is going to drive even more hundreds of millions of people into poverty if it is adopted. The green dream has become a green fantasy, and Europe actually underpinning much of their economic woes right now is the fact that renewable subsidies in Germany and Denmark and Italy and Spain are driving the place bankrupt. And Greece, they went into this whole thing too. So things are changing. Here's the two pipeline routes, one from Alberta to Kitimat, the other from Alberta to Vancouver, Burnaby in particular. These are the only two proposals I know of. I guess there could be other ways of doing it, but for some reason, certain people, including our mayor, think that it's okay to be against all of them, right? like when the mayor came out against the Kinder Morgan pipeline proposal, which comes down here to Vancouver, why didn't he say, by the way, I support the Northern Gateway as a superior route to bring the oil from Alberta to the coast so we can sell it to people who want to buy it? But no, apparently it's a viable position to be just against pipelines now. Whether it's the Keystone Pipeline or the Gateway Pipeline or the Kinder Morgan Pipeline, now it is reasonable as an environmental activist to just say, we don't want any pipelines. It's also apparently reasonable to be against oil tankers. There are continents that have seas in between them, and if you want to move stuff from one continent to another, which is large and bulky, makes more sense to do it by boat than plane for oil, for example. Imagine trying to get the oil to China in 747s. Or maybe a really big high-pressure hose that shoots it into the stratosphere, right? And then they have a funnel on the other side that it comes down into, right? The reason we use oil pipelines and oil tankers is because this turns out to be the most practical and safest way to do it. And in Vancouver Harbor, double hull, 4 tugs, dead slow, is the formula that has resulted in 50 years of no oil spills in the harbor of any significance from tankers. There's been oil spills from other types of boats, but not from tankers. Maybe they should go down to 3 knots. That would be the way I would negotiate this if I was an activist. I would say 5 knots is too fast. You got to get down to 3 knots, in which case even if it ran into something, nothing would probably happen. So instead, though, the position is no tankers. Period, even though tankers have been coming in and out of Vancouver Harbor for 50 years. So the only reason for the opposition to the oil pipelines and the tankers is to choke the oil sands development. That's really what it's all about. So in the end, I'll come to the oil sands and talk about those, because that's really what it's about. This is a funny story. This would make Ron Bailey's head explode, I think, if he ever heard this story. The Greenpeace diesel dilemma. Greenpeace just spent $32 million building a brand new ship, the Rainbow Warrior 3. Our first boat, the Rainbow Warrior 1, was $40,000. We bought it surplus in England and fixed it up. And it did a lot of good work. But now apparently it takes $32 million to have a Greenpeace boat. And their first campaign was against the construction of a Dutch coal-fired power plant. You can see it in the background there, that black thing by the water. And notice that it's surrounded by wind turbines. So obviously it got a bit of wind energy there, and Holland as well. But Greenpeace says, Holland, you must stop building this coal plant because our ship, you should be like us, our ship is driven by super efficient electric motors and sails that set a standard for sustainable shipping. It will be powered by the wind. They have good writers at Greenpeace, and that's a very powerful statement, except for these super efficient electric motors. How are they powered? By the wind? No, there are 2 large diesel engines in the hull of that ship. The diesel engines are powering the electric motors for when the wind isn't blowing, or isn't blowing in the direction they want to go, because this thing can't tack up wind. So they need the backup of fossil fuels for when the wind isn't blowing, just like the Dutch guys do on the beach there. They got a backup for the wind when it stops blowing. So how is that different? But oh, well, Greenpeace, of course, will be using biofuel in its diesel engines. Biodiesel? No, they're against biodiesel. And so for some reason it turns out that if you have a choice between biodiesel and real diesel, Greenpeace uses real diesel. Enough to make your head explode, right? That's the way it is there today. Climate change, there are many opinions on this. Some would tell you there's only one opinion, but actually 31,000 people in the United States alone signed the Global Warming Petition Project, in which case you have to send a letter in snail mail with your signature on it to get on this petition. You can't just click a box on the internet. And they say there's no convincing evidence that there will be catastrophic heating and the disruption of the Earth's climate. On the other hand, the International Panel on Climate Change says most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century, now that's 1950, that's just 60 years ago, is very likely due to the observed increase in greenhouse gas. Note that the IPCC doesn't say that a calamity of apocalyptic proportions is about to descend upon us. They just say that they think most of the warming that has occurred since 1950 is caused by us. That's all they say. And then there's Michael Crichton, the late Michael Crichton, a favorite of mine, who says, I am certain there is too much certainty in the world. And if something you should say about the debate on climate change, that is it. Because these people act as though you can predict the future of the climate with a computer model. You can't predict the future of much with a computer model, and certainly not the future of the world's climate. But We do know this is happening. CO2 is increasing, well, at least since we started measuring it accurately in 1959. Before that, all we have is ice cores and proxies and sediments and a bunch of stuff. So we don't have a totally accurate picture, but in a minute I'll show you we do know something about it. Now, this is the last billion years of climate change on planet Earth. There were 3.5 billion years before this when the climate was also changing, but I've picked the most recent data here, the last billion years. And during the last billion years, you can see that there have been warm periods and cool periods. The warm periods are called the greenhouse ages. We've never been in one, so, but that's what they called it when they looked back in history and saw there were some. And then there's the cool periods, which are known as the ice ages. We're in one now called the Pleistocene, 2.5 million years old. There's been 4 big glaciations and a few littler ones in that period. And right now we're in an interglacial period, but we are still in the ice ages. That's why there is all that ice on the poles. During the greenhouse ages, there was no ice on the Antarctic land mass, or on Greenland, or in the Arctic Sea. There was subtropical weather everywhere and tropical weather in the equator parts. But not long ago, the Canadian Arctic islands were covered in forests, subtropical forests with like redwood type trees growing on them. So it probably was warmer then, and they proved that by making this graph show us what happened in the past. But we're actually at a cool period in the Earth's climate history right now. They say, oh, but people weren't there during those warm periods. We couldn't possibly survive if a world was 22 degrees Celsius. Oh, right. Where does everybody want to go? Where it's 22 degrees Celsius. That's where everybody wants to go, or warmer. Thank you. People forget that we are actually a tropical species of life. Human beings, evolved at the equator. If it were not for clothing, fire, and housing, we could not survive here, or anywhere out of the tropics for that matter. Anywhere there's frost, we'd be dead ducks if we didn't have ways to keep us warm. So we're actually tropical, and it would be okay if the world got tropical again, at least for us. Not so good for the penguins, maybe. But it was their own fault that they evolved to be able to deal with all that ice. And they had no choice if they wanted to live there. And here is the last 600 million years, getting much closer to the present day. You see the black line is the CO2 concentration in the global atmosphere during those 600 million years. This is basically the history of modern life forms from 560 million years ago or so, the Cambrian explosion. And you see that it was very high. It was like 10 to 20 times higher than it is today, back when life evolved into large forms, into multicellular organisms, and then fell down and down and down as the new forests and the plankton, all the huge land plants, pulled the carbon out of the atmosphere. And by the late Carboniferous, it was down to a level similar to today. But then it went up again, and it went up to 2,000 parts per million. It's now at 390, going on 400. The optimum CO2 concentration for plant growth is between 1,500 and 2,000 parts per million, sort of up where it's been through most of the history of life. Right now, the plants are starving for carbon out there, the trees and everything, because that's why greenhouse operators put the exhaust from their heaters into the greenhouse on purpose in order to increase the CO2 by 3 or 4 times in there in order to make the plants grow faster. Hope it's not the person with the pie. They've been apprehended. That's good.
It's Greenpeace.
Yeah, believe me, I'm on, when I talk like in this kind of tone, I watch out for pies. This is really the most recent history. The Earth's temperature measured by thermometers from 1850 or so. And as you can see, there's been a recent uptick in global temperature of 0.4 degrees Celsius. The urban heat island effect might have influenced that, but nevertheless, it has got warmer in the last while, since 1970 or so. And so the International Panel on Climate Change says that since 1950, we've been the main cause of global warming. So they're saying that recent uptick was caused mostly by us. But what about the one between, where it says, why did it get warmer here? Between 1910 and 1940. It also increased by 0.4 degrees over a 30-year period there. Exactly the same amount and the same time as it did since 1950. When you ask the IPCC and those guys, why did it get warmer there? They say, well, probably it was natural causes of some kind. Yeah, like what's been causing the climate to change for 1 billion or more years was the natural causes. So one of the main logical arguments to apply to this, if they don't know what did that, how do they know we did that? I mean, it's just too obvious. They don't know. It is a guess. And for the last 15 years, this is the global temperature curve. It has not become warmer. even though we continue to put more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, it is a fact that even skeptics agree that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and that theoretically, all else being equal, which of course it isn't because there's all these other natural phenomena happening too, but all else being equal, you add more CO2 to the Earth's atmosphere, it should get a little warmer. The real debate is not about whether CO2 is a greenhouse gas and whether or not increases in it would cause some additional warming trend, all else being equal. The real issue is what will be the effect of the increased water vapor that is in the air as a result of it being warmer. The alarmists in their computer models use a factor of 3 multiples. They say that the increased water vapor will enhance the CO2 effect by 3 times. In other words, instead of a 1 degree increase in temperature, you'll get a 3 or 4 degree increase in temperature. Whereas the skeptics are saying no, actually the increased water vapor will moderate the impact of the CO2, and so that instead of 1 degree, it'll only be half a degree. That's what the debate's about, is what is going to be the effect of the additional water vapor in terms of cloud formation and the fact that water vapor is a strong greenhouse gas in itself. That's the argument. And we don't know the answer. But we do know that reality is not bearing out the computer models. This is the NASA satellite global air temperature, the most accurate record we have of what's happening to the temperature of the air. The black line on the bottom, the wiggly one, is reality. The 3 other lines are what the computer models predicted would happen. It's even more dramatic for the ocean temperature. In 2003, 3,000 buoys, called the Argo buoys, were released around the world in a representative way in all the world's oceans. They are free-floating, and every day they sink down to 700 meters and then come up very, very slowly, measuring the temperature profile, and then send it to a satellite. That black line is the result of that monitoring program, and the red one is what the climate model said would happen, all else being equal, if CO2 had a factor of 3 magnification from the water vapor. Not happening. A lot of fuss was made about this in the summer of 2007. The Arctic ice melted more than it usually does. You can see it's bounced back a bit since then, but not up to the levels it was back in the 80s. So there's been a downward trend in Arctic ice. But they never show you this graph, which is the Antarctic ice. The winter of 2007 was in fact the highest level of Antarctic ice. At the same time, it was the lowest in the Arctic. And if you add the two together, the little red line on the bottom shows you that there might be a little trend downward. One you'd expect that, seeing as though the Earth is 0.4 degrees warmer than it was in the 1970s. It isn't looking too much like a catastrophe, like falling off the edge of a cliff. Oh great, here's another keynote to PowerPoint issue. Good thing we weren't around 10,000 years ago. What is that picture supposed to be of? Oh yeah, it was when the sea level was 450 feet lower than it is today, but I don't know why I did that. The sea level has risen 450 feet approximately since the end of the last glaciation, when all the big glaciers on Canada melted in Siberia. But for the last 8,000 years, it hasn't moved much. And this demonstrates that. This is on the equator in Indonesia at Papua. And our guide actually said, to the best of our understanding, there hasn't really been any sea level rise for the last 8,000 years. That's why these islands, limestone islands, are undercut like this, all of them. It's just by the movement of water. Now, if the sea was rising at an appreciable level, there wouldn't be enough time for that to happen. That takes a long time to happen. So this is just one indication. And in general, 2 minutes. No, I can't do it in 2 minutes. Sorry. Okay, tropical energy is not increasing. Where am I going to go now? I'm going to show you that Sweden, Switzerland, and France have way lower per capita CO2 emissions than Germany and Denmark, because Germany and Denmark each produce their electricity more than 50% by coal, 85% in Denmark, yet they are held up as shining green examples because they don't have nuclear or hydroelectric, and they're putting in wind and solar. Meanwhile, Sweden, Switzerland, and France are the combination of hydroelectric, nuclear, biomass, a little gas in France, have about half the level of CO2 emissions per capita, and they're the ones who should be held up as a green example. Transportation is the most difficult challenge for CO2 emissions reduction. They've just stopped basically producing Chevy Volts because no one wants to pay $45,000 for a car the size of a Toyota Corolla. And same with the all-electric Nissan Leaf. These are great concept cars, but they are not going to end up being taken up by the masses at over 40,000 bucks a piece. So we need oil. Canada is an exemplary country, so says the World Health Organization, the Yale and Columbia Universities, International Labour Organization, Freedom in the World Report, Transparency International, and the Reputation Institute. We are as good as they get, and that's why it's okay to buy oil from us, even from the oil sands. Why? I went up there to see for myself what was going on, and it's an amazing operation. It's highly technical, but they have succeeded in being able to clean the oil at a profit. Clean the sand, that is, at a profit. Take the oil off the sand. When a service station puts 100 gallons of diesel in the dirt underground from a leak in a storage tank, they make them spend $1 million to get the oil off the dirt way underground instead of just paving over it like they should do and build something there. They spend all that money. What are they doing in the oil sands? They are taking the oil off the sand. One of the operations up there is actually called white sands because the two products of the oil sands are clean sand and oil. Then they sell the oil at a profit, and they're cleaning that place, making a profit doing it, unlike the gas stations. Well, I guess they made their profits while they were spilling the oil. But there it is. This pipeline between Russia and China is bigger than anything we have in North America. That is quite a relationship being built right there. But there were no Greenpeace people protesting this pipeline between Russia and China. Another point being there's 100,000 kilometers of oil pipes in North America. There they are, and the proposed ones. This is a coal mining operation in the United States. This is an oil sands operation in Canada. Is this really fundamentally more evil than this? I don't think so. It's just mining is what it is. But the most important thing is that every square inch of the oil sands disturbance will be reclaimed by law, and all the people operating there are proud that that's part of their culture, that they are going to put a boreal forest or a lake or a grassland where there was a disturbance from mining the oil. So Greenpeace shows you the before picture of the boreal and then the picture of the place all dug up, as if that is the final stage, when in fact it's just a blink in nature's eye that it's disturbed. The oil is taken off, the sand is cleaner, and the bisons are being raised by the Mackay First Nations, and the forest is being replaced. There might even be a timber harvest there, heaven forbid, at some time in the future. And this is good enough for me if they do this after they get the oil off the sand. And so I got involved in this oil sands issue because it disturbed me greatly that my country was being slagged so badly overseas in our friends' places like in London and in Berlin and in New York and Washington, saying that we were the great environmental criminals of the time, and that if the oil sands are exploited it will be game over for the climate and all this stuff, when in fact it's very obviously that we have the best human rights, the best environmental laws. There's a very good percentage, I think 25 or 30% women employed in the oil sands. There's $800 million plus going into First Nations corporations for contract work from the oil sands. Nobody employs more First Nations than the oil sands. And they're cleaning it when and they're fixing it up when they finish. So what is the problem, everybody? You know, that's my attitude towards this, and it's good enough for me what we're doing in the oil sands. They're not going to be reclaiming Edmonton or Los Angeles anytime soon, and that's a fairly major disturbance, a permanent one for where people live. But here, where nobody's living except the people in Fort McMurray, and I mean that place is going to be there for a long time because there's at least 200 years worth of oil to take out of the ground here. And at the end, though, it will all be rehabilitated back to a boreal forest again with a cleaner soil than it had in the first place. So thank you very much for listening.